Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Craftsy Chats. My name is Leah, and you'll see over there, I do have Sue from Sookie Sews here with us today. I'll say, hey, Sue, how are you?
Good, good. How are you doing today, Leah?
I'm doing very well. We're going to ask you lots of questions today, Sue, but before we do that, I want to give all of our viewers a few little heads up things so that you could take a look through the page. There are a couple links I want to draw your attention to. So first, whether this is your first live event that you're watching or if you've come back for so many of them, we would love to get some feedback from you. So if you scroll down where you're viewing, there is a link for a feedback survey, and we would love to know what it is that you like about these live events, what you might want to see in the future, so we can continue to improve these and make them everything we can for you, the viewers. So that's the first link. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is going to be a big banner that is going to be for some free projects. So maybe you participated in our Aliso mini-series, our Sew on the Go mini-series, or maybe that's something brand new to you. But if you want to either review those projects or come at them fresh, you should be able to click on a banner to access all of those free projects. Sue actually had one of them that we did. So I'm going to have her review that a little bit as well for us. And then the final thing, this is interactive. We want to hear from you. So please take note of the chat box. You're going to go ahead and drop your comments, your questions in there for the entire time that we have today. I'm going to ask as many questions as we can get to in our about an hour that we have. And if you want to, you can drop a little comment in there right now. Say hello, where you're viewing from. Let us know what's on your mind and start dropping your questions in. And as soon as I open them up, we'll get to as many as possible, like I said. So with all of that housekeeping out of the way, Sue, it's time to officially welcome you. I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our viewers. Tell us a little bit about your background and then maybe a little bit about what kind of projects you're working on right now.
Okay. All right. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Sue O'very Pruitt. I also go by Sookie, and that is the name of my business is Sookie Sews. So I have been in the sewing industry my entire career. I went to college for fashion design, and right out of college, I got into costume. I worked at Busch Gardens, which, if you're familiar with that, it's a theme park here in the Tampa Bay area, and I did costumes for a long time. I mean, without going through like all the things I've done, I've had a really full career in the sewing industry, and I have worked on cruise ships working on costumes, and I have done small leather goods all over the world, and I've had a really full career and got to experience all different aspects of the home sewing industry, which is what we're in, and then also the actual fashion and leather industry. So it's been a really fun ride. But for the last 12 years, I have run my own business, and I create patterns and sewing patterns. Machine embroidery are the two focuses, and then also serger patterns. So. And I do YouTube, and I have an online school myself, and of course I'm a Craftsy instructor. I've got a whole project series on in the hoop projects. So. And it's funny, you were talking about the project that we did together, the Sew on the Go, and it's like right over here. It's underneath things, but here's my little cord wrap, my cord wrangler. I actually love this. Sometimes we make things, we're like, oh, I'll put it over here. I use this every day because it wraps. Hold on one second. I got to pull it from underneath things, but it actually wraps the cord for my iron. And it's just the most wonderful little thing. So, but it's underneath like a stack of things. Everything that was back here is now over here.
You have a whole new setup, I heard.
Yes, we did. My husband and I, we just redesigned the sewing studio, and everything's bright and white. We've got like lots of storage over here, and on this side of the room, well, and of course I got my sewing machine here, and then you can't see it's offset, but I have another table with my embroidery machine. And it's kind of all just very inspirational. It's so funny though. Like, do you see the picture that's right over my shoulder?
Yes.
I don't know if you can all see it. It's this beautiful turn of the century ladies having lunch at the Ritz in Paris, and that picture pretty much inspired the way that the room came out. So had fun with it.
Well, it's a fantastic piece that we can see over your shoulder there, Sue. Now, before we get into questions from our viewers, is there anything that you've been working on in the past couple days, weeks, projects that you have online for you that you want to share with us?
I do. This is actually going to be brand new this Friday, and it's getting ready for the holidays. And it's a table runner. I might actually stand up to show you all, but it's called the Gifts Galore Table Runner. You can kind of see here it goes. And the idea, though, is that, and I'll come a little closer, is that the little bows are actually three-dimensional and they snap on and off. So you can essentially put these bows anywhere you want on the gifts. And then you can rotate them. And then after the holidays, when you're ready to put this away, instead of the bows getting all smushed, you can just take everything off. Everything will fold up real nice onto itself. And then the bows can get kind of stored in a Ziploc bag next to it so that the bows don't get crushed while they're being stored. So this is going to be a new pattern coming out this weekend.
Well, that's exciting. That actually does lead into the first question in our chat box pretty
Okay.
nicely. So I'm going to jump right into the questions here. This one comes from Monica. Monica says, my family always exchanges handmade Christmas gifts. Is there anything that you are excited about creating for this year, Sue?
You know what? Yes, Monica, I totally get it. As long as I can remember, we've had some sort of, like, especially as a child, I remember we all made gifts. I think a lot of it had to do with, like, you could tell when my parents were having a good year financially and maybe not so good the next year. But I remember them saying, okay, this year we're making all of our gifts. But some of those gifts are some of my best memories. I remember my dad made me a flamingo marionette. And I remember my mom made me all my Barbie doll clothes. So it's so funny. Like, I don't remember, all the other things, but I remember my gifts from that year. So to answer your question, Monica, yes, we actually, because we've remodeled like the sewing area and my husband's office is all redone, we pretty much we've completely redecorated the whole living space. And so now we are going to be decorating for the holidays differently. I'm going to make definitely a Christmas tree skirt. I need a new one of those. And then we've got some ideas to do some wall hangings. And as far as gifts, I know for sure I want to make a quilt for my stepdaughter. She just went off to college, and I want to make a quilt for her. And then my daughter has requested some new skirts. So those things for sure, definitely. How about you, Monica? What are you doing?
I was just going to say, anybody, Monica or any of our viewers,
Yeah,
if you can
everybody.
drop in holiday ideas into the chat box, we'll take that as well. We
Yes.
love to crowdsource here on these lives. Let's move into our next question. This one comes from Zansan. And as a new quilter, I'm having problems with Y seams. Sue, do you have any tips to make them easier? I'm not sure how much quilting you get into.
What is the have troubles with what seams?
Y, the letter Y.
Oh, the letter Y. You mean like when you're putting them together? I guess that's the only thing I can think. I'm not
I'll keep an
familiar.
eye if there's any clarifications that drop in. But
Yeah, I'm
yeah,
not familiar with that terminology. Though there's so many aspects of sewing, and definitely my specialty is machine embroidery and sewing, home deck, purses, garments, quilting. I've made, I don't know, probably 40 quilts in my years, and I have different things that I talk about, but I'm not familiar with that terminology. I'm so sorry.
okay, well, if there's anybody out there that is and has
Yeah,
any, you can drop those into the chat box as well. We
there you
do
go.
have some of these lives with people that specifically quilt. So tune
Yeah.
in for another one as well if that's your question, if you're looking for some quilting tips. Hello, Prin from Michigan. We've got Sandy from Arkansas, Linda from Canada.
Hello.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. If you weren't here for the very top of the hour, check into that chat box. Some of the links that I told you about some free patterns and a feedback survey, those have been dropped into the chat box as well by our fantastic behind the scenes team.
Yeah.
Let's go into Stephanie's question next, Sue. So Stephanie
Okay.
says, hi, newbie here to sewing, and I'm really enjoying it. And one issue that I have is lining up the fabric on the cutting board and then cutting it to its proper measurements. So Sue, do
Hmm.
you have tips on how to get that right?
There's a couple of things. I know that when I'm cutting material, well, first of all, you can only follow one guide. You either follow the ruler or the cutting mat as far as measuring. Because not everything is going to be perfectly precise. You got to kind of decide which one you're going to follow. But let's say I'm cutting, let's just say a shirt or a garment or a tote bag. You always want to have your material cut on the straight of grain. And then the best way to do that is take a ruler from the edge of let's just say the table, and measure over and decide on a space for it. Let's say if this is your material, find the center and measure from the table to the center. And let's just say that it's 10 inches. And then measure over 10 inches, and that's how you'll get your straight. And so that's usually how I do it. I usually do it with a tape measure, though, and then go from there. And patterns always have a line. They'll always have a straight of grain line, so you'll know where that line needs to match up. And of course, the other thing I would say is when you're working with fabric, it's not always straight. For those of you out there, have you ever bought fabric from the shop and you get home and then one side's like this and the other side's like this, and it's not always straight. So to add to the question, the best way to get the straight of grain is to actually clip a little piece of the fabric and rip it, and then that will actually achieve the straight of grain, because as soon as you rip it, it rips right on the weave of the fabric, and then there's no confusing what's straight. It'll tell you right there.
All right,
hopefully that helped.
Fantastic. And hopefully any of our newbies to sewing can make something out of those tips there. Denise, this is Denise's first live. Greetings from Rosenberg, Texas. Hello.
Nice. Hello, Denise.
We've got Deep Creek Lake in Western Maryland with Teresa. And another question coming in. This one is from Sandy. So Sandy asks, won't the overlock stitches on our sewing machines work just fine for those of us that don't want to purchase a serger?
Good question. So there's a lot of good tips out there how to first finish your edges. It depends on what kind of material it is. The only true difference between an overlock stitch on your presser foot on your sewing machine and the serger is that there's more needles on a serger. There's usually 2 versus the 1 on a sewing machine. And then the other big difference is that it cuts the fabric. So with a serger, not only does it serge, or let's just say sew, it finishes the edges, but it also cuts the raw edge off. So it cuts the raw edge off and then it finishes it. Whereas usually with a sewing machine, there's nothing to cut there. You've already cut your seam and then you're stitching over it. Sometimes what happens though is the threads kind of they warp around when you're doing it with a sewing machine. So what you can do though to prevent that is take a piece of, let's just say, tissue paper, and here's your seam, here's your seam, and then take a piece of tissue paper, not directly under it, but a little bit over. And then when you use the overlocking stitch, it will sort of catch the tissue paper, and then when you're finished, you can rip the tissue paper off. And then that way your overlock stitch from your sewing machine will be nice and flat. This is something that I probably don't do very often, but it's a good way to get practice and kind of figure out how far do I need to go over to get that overlocking. And then check on your sewing machine. It just depends on your machine, but there are lots of different options for overlocking stitches. And there's a presser foot. There's one, and I think it's called the overlock foot, and it has like 2 bars, and then the threads kind of wrap around that, and then they lay flat. So hopefully that answers your question. Maybe gives you a little homework. Go see if your presser foot or if your machine has one of those presser feet. If not, they're easy to find. You can go online or maybe check with a local shop. And eventually, if you get into where you're doing a lot of overlocking, you may want to treat yourself to a serger, maybe down the road.
All right, we have more hellos coming in from as far as London and Romania.
What?
So welcome.
Nice.
Very excited to see all of you out there. We're getting into some pant making for our next question here, Sue.
Okay.
So this one comes in from Jane.
Hi,
Jane says, I'm very confused by pant making. After fronts and backs are cut out and sewn, it seems that one side of the pants is correct and the other side is inside out. Is there a trick to putting that together that I am missing, as I am pretty sure I am cutting and sewing correctly? This relates to simple pull-on pants only, a front and a back, then an elastic waistband. That's what Jane's talking about.
Okay. There's 2 ways to construct pants. You can either sew the fronts together, like down like the front of the front seam, the crotch seam. There's that. and then do the same with the back, and then you sew your side seams. Or some people like to sew their side seams first and then they sew the other piece. So for me, I've always been a fan of, I sew my fronts together and then I sew my backs together. And then I lay those right sides together, and then I stitch down the sides, and then I stitch up through the inseam. And then there's no mistaking it. So, because I know exactly what she's talking about. Sometimes the patterns, they get a little confusing, but that's just how I've always made pants. It's funny why we do things. You know, if you're taught by your grandma or your sister or a colleague or a friend. I was taught by some of the best back when I worked at Busch Gardens. But I mean, I was like 19, 20 years old when I worked there. And I learned a lot from this sweet little old lady. She was like 85 and she worked on Broadway in her youth. And so she would show us all kinds of tricks. And if we do it wrong, she would slap our hand and then show us the right way to do it. So I did. That's how I learned to make pants fast, because then there's no confusing. There's no right sides. But you know, there's lots of ways to do things, but that's just the way that I have been most successful with. So hopefully that helps out.
All right, there's actually quite a few newbies. We've got
Really?
Rachel saying that Rachel is a newbie to sewing, listening for tips to share. Rachel, you are not alone out there as far as viewers today. So, Sue, I'm actually going to just give you a general question for anybody that's watching that is new to sewing. What would you say would be the essential must-haves for their first project?
Well, let's see. As far as there's notions, there's all the gadgets that you would need to get started. Um, Hold on one second. I'll just pull out my thing here. I would say a good pair of fabric shears
Mhm.
is an essential. And I would say it's something, you know, like we look at things and we look at tools as cost, but if you invest in the right tools, then you're going to have them forever. I've had this pair of fabric shears. I don't want to say exactly how old I am, but hey, I'm 45 and I've had these since I was 18. I get them professionally oiled and sharpened every few years. So probably back then they cost me $20. They're not much more now, but that's kind of, you know, how it is. But I will say this, I have started a lot of new hobbies and I've bought all the good things. And then I realized, maybe I'm not really into this. So buying a $30 pair of fabric shears may not be the first thing you do, but if this is something after a little while you're like, oh, I really like this, then you do it. I mean, just to look in this is my go-to drawer. This is like where all my little notions live, right next to here. I would say, to answer her question, a seam ripper, a good one. There's lots of seam rippers. Most sewing machines come with a free one. I actually really like this seam ripper because it has this little rubber little rubber nub at the end of it. And when you rip out the seam, and then you have all these threads hanging, this little rubber piece makes the threads disappear. I actually have a whole video on this if you like Google, like if you search sergers or seam rippers, you can find this on my YouTube channel, because this is such a cool thing. So I would say a good seam ripper. I would also say a good point turner. This little bamboo point turner, it's wood, it's natural. I mentioned this on the last time I was on Craftsy, that you can actually put steam into this and then it infuses the moisture, and then you can offset it into the heat of the product, whatever you're pressing. So this is an essential. And I would say, I mean, there's so many. In fact, I have a video of my top 10 like favorite notions, but this is an essential too. I love a magnetic pin cushion, and I love these little flower head pins. They're big. You can see them on the ground. If you have pets or children, it's easy to see. And I would say those are probably the good essentials, the things that I use every time I sit down and sew. And that's just to get you started.
Perfect. I know we always have a lot of questions from people that are starting out as to what is worth actually buying so that they can start these projects out. So that's really
Yeah.
helpful. Oh, we have a question about some upcoming projects that you've got, Sue. So Jay
Okay.
wants to know, are you planning on doing any bag projects in the future?
Well, the bags that, let's see, we've got a serger bag that's coming out really soon. And I don't have that sample in front of me. The only bag that I have in front of me is a machine embroidery one. But as far as sewing, we've got a hobo bag that we're working on. that'll probably be ready in sometime in November. We just bought the fabric for it. And the serger bag, and I'm sure my mind's drawing a blank, but as far as embroidery bags, we have a couple of new ones. So if you have an embroidery machine, this right here is our newest, and it's got a little zipper here, but all the flowers are all machine embroidery. So and it's called the garden flower clutch. That's the newest.
All right. Well, we're going to stay on bags with our next question here. Just curious, Sue, do you have any patterns or advice on how to sew a leather backpack purse?
I do not have any purse patterns for that. I think that there's some really good leather designers out there, specialty purse designers. Um, it's so funny. The Bernina blog just did a really good thing showing leather. So that might be somewhere to check out. But as far as leather, I would say the biggest tips that I have, it's been a little while since I've stitched on leather, but I did it for a long time. And you want to make sure you have a leather needle. I know it sounds so simple, but sometimes we think, oh, my machine can stitch through that and I'll be no problem. And then it's as simple as changing to the right needle makes all the difference. Another thing would be to have a good roller. So what I mean by that is leather is a natural substance, right? It's a natural material, and it's not going to respond really well to like a basic iron. So you need to usually open the seams with a pressing tool, and then you glue them down. But I'm not sure this is the right tool. They've got one that's better, but I'm just going to show this to you to give you an idea, like this little roller. I don't think this is going to be strong enough to roll leather seams, but there's one that's wood, and it's got like a little wood handle, and the actual roller, this little roller right here, it's about this big, and it rolls down your seams. So I would say invest in some good neat. Just get the needles; they're not that expensive, maybe $6-7, and then get a little roller. That'd be good to get.
Right. Good luck working all of those leather bags out
Yeah.
here. We've got a lot of love for the sewing machine overlock stitching tips from earlier. And a question from Nancy as well. Nancy says, I'm making 2 girls' outfits for gifts, and I intend to use French seams. Do you think that's okay, or does that feel like it might be too bulky?
No, French seams are lovely, especially with little kids, because my daughter's 12 now, but I remember when she was probably in the 5 to 8 range. It didn't matter what I put on her. If it had any scratchiness, if she could feel the seam, she'd get all, bugged out. So I started doing a lot of French seams with her product, with her patterns and stuff, and when I was making things for her. So yeah, French seam is basically, and they're lovely. When you open up the garment, you don't see a raw edge. You don't see material. You see an extra kind of like a little pocket around the fabric, and they're really nice. It's French seams were really big, and if you ever look at some old vintage dresses from, I'm going to say 30s, 40s, they always have French seams in them because it finished it off really lovely. My biggest tip with French seams is make sure you're on point with your measurements. French seams, let's just say the seam allowance is 5/8 inch. Usually your first seam is going to be a 1/2 inch, and then you cut it down, and then you wrap it around, and then you've got that extra little 1/8 of an inch left. So just whatever the instructions say, follow the pattern, but be right on point with your measurements, or else the whole thing won't fit. And then the problem is, not only do you get to rip one seam out, you get to rip 2 seams out. So be on point with your measurements.
All right, I'm going to jump back a little ways for anybody, not just, let me check and see who asked the question about the leather here. VBK, I can't say the username. It's not a name,
Okay.
but the leather question that came in, just a heads up for everybody that's watching, there are some classes that you can access as well, I believe, on Craftsy. Leather
Yeah,
classes by Ellie Loom and Dawn Morin, so you can search those as well,
there you go.
aside from just the tips that Sue was able to give us just now. Let's move on to our next question from Talia. Talia says, what is the adjustment that I need to make in a pair of jeans when the crotch just gets that slouchy, puffy look? Is it in the crotch seam? Is it in the side seat seams? What do you think, Sue?
the truth, I would pull it from the waist up. So if you think about putting on, let's just say that you're a little girl and you're putting on your daddy's pants, when you put them on, if you keep pulling them up, eventually the crotch seam will align. But what if you pulled up that top portion that's going up past your waist? That's where I usually make my adjustment when it comes to a crotch seam. And I have a funny story if you want to hear it
Oh,
about
yes.
that. Okay, so back in the days of working at Busch Gardens, I was very young, very new, and I was full of like ready to learn and eager, right? I had already gone to college, but life lessons are always the ones that stick with you better. So I remember I was making this pair of pants for this young man, and we had a big, like what she just described, there's lots of slouchiness. And instead of doing what I just described by pulling it up from the waist, I just went right in there at the crotch and I put a safety pin. And everyone's just looking at me like, wow, that is really wrong. First of all, it was the wrong thing to do, but it was just very uncomfortable. And that poor young man, it was just kind of squirming. So my boss taps me on the shoulder. She goes, that's one way to do it. However, here, I'm going to show you another way. She didn't embarrass me or anything. But let me tell you, they all made good fun of me afterwards for years and years. So so yeah, instead of grabbing it right there, just hike it up at the waist, and then that will give you the perfect placement.
Oh, Sue, that's a fantastic story because as a theater actor myself, we were frequently trained to never question the costume. Just wear what you're given and go out there and do.
Oh, there's so
Oh,
many things I remember by learning. I worked there for 5 years, but they were the first 5 years right out of college. So I just wanted to make everybody proud and happy, but I learned a lot. But you're right, because so many of the entertainers were wonderful to work with. This young man, he didn't even. You're right. That's good training. He didn't say anything. He was like, okay.
all right. How'd I go?
But I learned and I never forgot. So hopefully that will help the lady who had asked the question.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Oh, another pants, but also anything that really has a zipper.
Mm.
Question for anyone out there. Deanna wants to know, what is the easiest way to put in a zipper?
Practice with regular cotton fabric first. And the easiest way is, and without really having anything to show, and this kind of, I think there's a whole series on this on Craftsy though, a whole series on zippers. But the easiest way is to sew your materials right sides together and stitch your seam allowance. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, the seam allowance is 1 inch. So you stitch your 1 inch seam allowance, and then you're going to open up your seam and you're going to press the seam open. So now you've got your material, you've got your seam allowance, it's nice and pressed open. And then I would lay the zipper, right sides of the zipper are going to be to the wrong side of the material. And then really it's just a matter of like basting it in there, but just stitching around the opening. And then once you open up that seam you initially made, it will expose the zipper. That's the easiest way to make a zipper. But it really depends on the pattern of the project that you're working on. The way that you put a zipper in a pair of jeans, for example, compared to like a little zipper like this where the zipper is exposed, are going to be a different application. So there is some really good classes on Craftsy on that though.
All right, I'm actually going to jump to what you just held up to the camera because we
Oh,
have a question
okay.
about that right there. Yeah, Zansan wants to know if you could describe the difference between the embroidery machine, a
Yes.
sewing machine, and a quilting machine, since they're all different.
Wonderful question. Okay, so first of all, a sewing machine is going to just have one needle, and it's going to have a bobbin, and then the needle's going to sink down and pull the bobbin thread up, and that's how you form your stitches. That is the same thing for a machine for embroidery and also quilting. When it comes to a sewing machine's function, it's to form stitches. It's some of them are computerized. They're electric. We plug them into the wall and they're electric. And some of them are computerized, meaning that you can press buttons that will control how long your stitch is or how wide your stitch is, maybe how fast your stitch goes. But then let's talk about an embroidery machine. Embroidery machines are truly computerized. And in order for the design, I'm going to hold this up, in order for the design to come to life, somebody has to create it. It's not usually the person who's behind the machine. It's a designer like myself, someone who has got the software to create it. just like a graphic, just like if you were a photographer and then you sold your artwork. That's the same thing for an embroidery project. So I have the software. I created all these little designs, and then for an embroidery machine, you would get that design from wherever, from the computer, and into your machine. And then you would have a hoop. And I don't have any hoops in front of me, but an embroidery hoop will hold your materials, and then you kind of just stitch one color at a time and it will bring it to life. So an embroidery machine is definitely different than a sewing machine. Now, when it talking about a quilting machine, a sewing machine can quilt. But if you're talking about like the big long arm machines that actually take all the layers and put them together and quilt them, then they're usually just a single needle and they only sew straight. But just like an embroidery machine has patterns and software that you can like add to it, there's some quilting machines out there that have the same thing. There's some quilting machines that are bigger than my room here. So that's a really good question though. And then of course there's so many within each brand, and there's lots of price points. I mean, you can get a sewing machine for $50 now, right? And you could also spend $4,000 on a sewing machine. Same goes for a quilting machine and an embroidery machine.
Now, Joanna's curious. I'm sure she's not the only one. Sue, do you do many quilting projects? I know you said that wasn't your area of expertise.
No, it is not my area of expertise. It's so interesting because, I think a lot of us crafty type people, we get into something and we'll make this, but then we find what we're really passionate about. And there's nothing to be ashamed about that. For me, machine embroidery and sewing, that's definitely been my passion. I have made, like I said, about 40 quilts over the past 20 years or so. And I think with quilting, it is I like things that are little, things that I can do quickly, and there's some really great quilts that do stitch up fast. My extent of quilting these days is more smaller projects, though. Because here's the thing, I have so many friends that are craftsy instructors even, and if I have a quilting question, I know who to go to ask, and when they have an embroidery question or a sewing question, they know who to ask. And I think that's what makes it so nice in our industry, that everybody has their specialty, but they know just enough about something else. But any questions that if I can't answer, though, we certainly can, Leah. We can find the answers if we need to. We know enough people.
Of course, that's the beauty of this community for sure.
Yeah.
All right, let's go on to Caroline's question next. Caroline says, how would you sew a patch on the back of a denim jacket? A very large patch, almost the whole back straight stitch, zigzag, length of stitch. What do you think, Sue?
All right, so first the question I have back is it a patch that's like already done, like you buy it? I have this one patch I've had forever. It's like a Betty Boop, and I bought it as a patch. And my plan one day is to put it on the back of my denim jacket. So that's actually already a patch. Whereas if you just need to patch something, maybe it's a piece of fabric. But if it's a patch, like what I would think of as a patch, I've got a couple of tips. In fact, I'm looking over here at my stuff. There's two things that I would use to get that patch onto the material. I wouldn't just lay it underneath the sewing machine and start stitching. I would first apply the patch to the fabric. That way it's good and it's going to stay in place. It's not going to shift or move around while we're stitching it. So usually on the back of a patch, there's a built-in adhesive. I have never really been very successful with those. I feel like when I press them, they're made for like commercial pressing devices. But so what I do is I take a fabric glue stick and I put it on the back of the patch, and then I lay it to we'll call it the denim jacket. And then I give it a good like hand press, not iron press, just a hand press. And then I do the shake test. I lift it up and I shake it. Is it going to stay? If it's going to stay in place, I feel pretty confident about that. The other option is spray adhesive. And somewhere down here, I have a bottle of spray adhesive, but there's all kinds. You just want to make sure you get a fabric spray adhesive. So any fabric shop, quilt shops, the big box stores, they're all going to have a spray adhesive. So in that case, instead of the fabric glue, I would take the patch, I would put it wrong side facing up on top of a sheet of paper. And then I would take my spray adhesive, and just like hairspray or deodorant, I would just spray it on top, let it set for maybe 3 or 4 seconds, just so that it kind of gets a little tacky. And then I would take that and immediately put it on the wrong side or on the back of the denim jacket. So now we've got it applied, right? And then the next part of the question was straight stitch or zigzag. Typically, I would use a straight stitch with matching thread, or maybe even like a clear thread, like a monofilament thread. I think the problem when you do a zigzag on top of a patch that already has an existing zigzag, it's very difficult to match up the right color, the right length of zigzag. And I feel like a straight stitch is going to be strong enough. I mean, it's just got to stay on the back of your jacket and go through washing. You're not going to be pulling any seams on it. So I think a straight stitch would be probably good. And I would probably use between a 2.5 and a 3.0 length. So that's what I would do.
All right, and Caroline did drop in a little bit of a clarifier. So this is a
Oh, okay.
square that is very heavy fabric and there's nothing on the back of it.
Okay, so then I would probably use either of those methods. Like I said, even, the stuff that's usually on it isn't usually good. And if it's a square, and you can maybe see if it has a satin stitch. If it doesn't have a satin stitch and you're putting it on there, well, then you're not competing with the previous thread and the zigzag length. So if you want to do a satin stitch, you could absolutely do that. I would challenge you to check with your machine, because if it's a computerized machine, some machines actually stitch straight down, and then there's a setting where they'll actually stitch sideways. So check to see if your machine has that. I know one of mine does, but the little one that's back here doesn't. So if I was stitching on that, I would probably straight stitch or zigzag, whichever you choose. And when you get to the corner, just position your material.
All right, good luck with a patch.
Yeah, good luck.
Ooh, let's talk a little bit more about that digitizing that you mentioned earlier, Sue. C. Lombard wants to know what software you use to digitize your embroidery designs.
So the software I use is the Bernina Embroidery software version 9, and I've been digitizing for 25 years. So the software, you know how it is. I mean, do you have the same phone? Do you have the same cell phone that you had even, like, let's say 6 years ago? Do you know how technology is? Something's always new coming out. So this one it's actually brand new, and I'm the spokesperson for this software, for the Bernina Embroidery version 9 software. So that's what I use. I've used lots of softwares, though, for the past 25 years. This is definitely the most user friendly and allows me to be the most creative. That's the one I use.
All right, well, thank you for giving us that info. I think a lot of people like that idea. Let's go to Linda next. We're going back to pants again.
Okay.
So Linda says, I really like pants with side zippers, but hardly ever find pant patterns with them. Are they that much harder to make or fit? And also, is it hard to convert a regular front zipper pattern to a side seam zipper?
No, it is not hard to convert. You can put a zipper wherever you've got a seam. It doesn't matter. The only challenge would be the curve of the side seam. So if you have very narrow hips, the curve from your waist to your hips isn't going to be as much. I have more like this going into here. So for me, a side zipper is going to look a little more like that. But it still is definitely doable, because when you're sewing a zipper in, you're going to be sewing it flat. I like a side zipper too. I think it's concealed better. I don't need any more emphasis on the front of my body. So I like a side zipper, especially on skirts or a pair of pants. Sometimes too with design elements, you've got a lot of pleating. The last thing you want is the bulk of a zipper in the front or even in the back. But yeah, to answer the question, you can absolutely do it as long as you have two seams that meet up together. You would just probably need to add a little extra seam allowance when you're cutting. Most patterns have a half inch to a 5/8 inch seam allowance. With a zipper, I usually like to start off with an inch, because then I've got a little extra leeway. I will tell you, this sort of has to do with this question, Leah, but doing costumes or making garments for anybody other than yourself, adding more seam allowance in the initial pattern is never a bad idea, because then you've got a little extra room to take in or let out. And then if you are making something for somebody else, if you have to let out, there's no shame in it. They don't even recognize that you're doing it. So that extra little quarter or half inch that you add when you're cutting out your pattern, it could definitely help, especially with a side zipper.
All right, bring the side zipper back.
Yeah, I vote yes.
All right, Susan's got our next question. Susan says, I'm looking for inspiration and instruction on upcycling some better clothing. So I've
Ooh,
collected lots of vintage kimono fabric as well as
oh,
silk shirts and cashmere coats. I'm
nice.
hoping to incorporate hand stitching and possibly some small vintage beads into clothing. And I'm hoping that the finished items are classy, not interested in really creating costumes. So
Yeah,
what are some tips that you would have for her, Sue?
I would say first, choose a, let's just say that you want to upcycle it into, because you could upcycle it into many things, right? A pillow, a wall hanging, a quilt, a shirt, a purse. I mean, there's hundreds of options of what you can upcycle it in. I would say find an inspiration of something that you like. Okay, I want to make a, let's just say a top. Let's just say you want to make a simple top. Find a pattern that you like, that fits you well, and then start having some fun designing it. Treat it like an art canvas. The simpler, the better, I would think, especially with wanting to add hand stitching and beading. Oh my goodness, it's going to be lovely. You're going to have a lot of fun with that. I would say find something simple, a simple silhouette. Even if it's a pillow, simple silhouette. Purse, simple silhouette. And then the vintage material and all of the embellishments that you're going to add, that's where the design's going to come in.
All right, good luck. That sounds exciting. I really
Yeah.
love doing stuff like
I
that.
want to see all these things finished. I love this stuff. This is exciting.
Absolutely. Oh, Altoria here is another beginner. So, beginner in learning to
Welcome.
sew, having a little problem. So, Altoria says stitches on the top are smooth, but the stitches underneath are loose and messy, and I can't correct the problem. What do you think might be going on there, Sue?
Well, if the machine was in front of me, the first thing I would do is I would unthread everything and I would rethread it. I would also check the needle and I would also check to make sure that the presser foot is in fact down. It's so easy to forget. We're ready to start sewing and you put your material underneath, and I would say that half the time an issue like that is because the presser foot didn't get landed onto the fabric. And it's not really even the foot being on the fabric that makes a difference, but what happens is as soon as your presser foot touches the bottom of your machine, it engages the tensions, and that's what makes it nice and tight on the top and the bottom. Usually, loose bobbin is that the bobbin, just try and put it in. Maybe there's a video on your machine online. I bet if you go to YouTube and you type in the model of your machine and how to thread it, it'll show you exactly how to do it. Bobbins are they're sometimes they're a little tricky. They're small. They got lots of little doohickeys on them, and sometimes it's confusing. Do I have the thread go this way? Do I go this way? Do I go behind this little hook? So that would be what I would check. If it's a machine that has a bobbin that's in, like you put the bobbin into the machine versus a little case, usually you put the bobbin, if I'll teach you how I remember this, but usually you put the bobbin in with the thread coming over to the left, like the shape of a P. So when you hold your bobbin up, if it looks like a shape of a P and you put it in straight down like that, that's usually the way that it goes in. If you have it the other way and it's not meant to go that way, you also could have lots of looping.
All right, good luck. It feels like the equivalent of turning it off and turning it back on again.
Sometimes, oh boy, yeah. But I think that's a, she's ready, she's ready to go, and then she's being stopped by a wonky bobbin. So give some of those tips a try.
Yes, good luck. Very good luck to you. All right, we've got quite a bit of something headed our way with this next one from Rebecca. So
Okay.
I'll go through it and you let me know if you need any clarification, Sue.
All right.
So Rebecca has a friend that was gifted some painted flour sacks, and she wants Rebecca to help her make a collage. I don't think that's the right term, Rebecca says. I've suggested that we cut the flour sacks, use muslin backing to stabilize, add strips of greenery with some flowers going up and down, get some fiber fill, add backing, finish off with the border, and the flour sacks have the 7 days of the week painted on them, and the
Oh,
seventh
wow.
day throws you off. I'm at a loss, but what would be the best way to approach this? Do you have any ideas?
There's two ideas that pop into my head. So it sounds like you're making a quilt. Is that ultimately the way that it sounds like? Adding sashing, adding backing, adding binding. I'm going to assume it's a quilt until you tell me otherwise. But what I would say is when you have that odd man out, you can do one of two things. You can either add an entire new row and make it the center focal, or put it on the back side, and that it can become your quilt label even. Those are my two thoughts.
Okay, well, Rebecca, if you want to clarify and dig a little deeper, I'll keep an eye out for any further comments from you. But hopefully, that's a good starting point.
Yeah.
Let's go to Rhonda next. Rhonda asks, how would you make stretchy pants for going to the gym? That kind of type. I love them. They are very comfortable. Rhonda, I love them too.
I know it's funny. So many people have been working at home and now, okay, Rhonda, I promise I'm going to answer your question, but I do have to tell you a funny story really quick. So I'm in different Facebook groups with people that are like me that do what I do, because sometimes when you work isolated at home, I've been doing this for 12 years. I pretty much only see my husband who now works with me, but I see my husband and I see my kid and I see my dogs, right? So I kind of live in workout pants, you know. I don't work out, but I got workout pants. But so I live in these things. So, anyways, to answer the question, the first thing is if you take a knit, an activewear knit, and you put your material together and you put it through your sewing machine, as soon as you're done with your stitch and you pull it, you're going to hear snap, 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 snap. Because as you're stitching, it's not the material stretches, but the thread isn't stretching. Hopefully that makes sense. So there's a couple of options. If you have a serger, head to your serger. That's the most proven method of stitching workout pants. But not everybody has a serger in doing that. So there is a new thread called, if you want to write this down, it's called Seraflex. The spelling, I'm not sure. I want to say it's Searflex, and I apologize in advance, but it's by Metler. It's a brand new thread, and the idea is that it actually stretches with the material. I've only used it once. I was completely blown away. I was like, what? You know, I can do this on my sewing machine. So that might be something to consider. And then the other thing, when you are stitching on a regular traditional sewing machine, unless your machine is just a straight stitch, there are two options that you can look at on your machine. One is a teeny tiny zigzag. So instead of I'm trying to think, I would probably go, maybe the width would be 0.5 and the length would be maybe 1. Try it out, but you're looking for a teeny tiny zigzag. And that way, when your material stretches, and let's say you bend over and you need stretch, as soon as you stretch, it's not just a straight stitch, it's going to snap. It's a zigzag. It's got a little bit of give. But the better stitch is actually called a stretch stitch. And it actually stitches on an angle. So instead of a zigzag, it goes like this. It goes up, down, up, down, up, down. So those are the tips that I would suggest for trying out the material. And you know what? Just get yourself some, try it, and it's a learning lesson. And whatever you learn from that one, you're not gonna, what's the saying? You either win or learn. You will succeed though, and then you'll try the next one and you'll get even better.
Yes. Oh, I like that. You'll either win or you'll learn. I'm taking that not even just for life.
Hey, it's life lessons, right?
All right, well, Sandy has our next question, but Sandy also dropped in the Seraflex elastic thread that you were talking
Yes.
about. There, it's in the comment box. So if you're out there wondering how to spell it, Sandy dropped it in there for
Thanks,
you.
Sandy. It's cool stuff, boy. It's really cool.
All right, Sandy's question is about machine embroidery. So, what is your favorite thread for machine embroidery? I chose to buy a set of Gutermann for all around sewing. I
Mm-hmm.
can't buy expensive threads. So, with that budget in mind, what do you think, Sue?
There's lots of different threads. I suppose it really depends on where you're getting your thread to. I would probably avoid buying like a big box of embroidery thread that you're stuck with. I would recommend that you buy maybe smaller spools. Metler is my go-to embroidery thread. I like them because they're smaller spools. I'm not investing $10 for a spool of thread. I'm investing like $3. And the other thing, the other one is Madeira is a really nice spool, a nice embroidery thread. Again, it's on a smaller spool. Um, I really like Isacord. that works really nice on my machine. And I would also say that it's got a lot to do with the machine, because I have friends who have different brands of me, and they'll be like, oh, I love this thread. And I'm like, really? It just snaps like crazy in my machine. I cannot get it to work. So I think that once you get a couple of smaller spools of thread, get black, get white, red, maybe treat yourself to 3 pretty colors, maybe a pretty pink, and things that you're going to use for a project. But test out the brand before you invest a bunch of money, because I did that early on, and then I was stuck with thread that just kept snapping. And just as a snapping thing too, the more saturated with dye a thread is, think about like purple and black, that the tension of the thread, the tenacity or whatever, it may break more easily. But that's just it. So maybe don't base black as your deciding factor, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Maybe like whites or tans or creams or light grays. They're always good colors to have in your stash.
All right, good luck finding some. Sandy says thank you. Before we get to our last few questions, we are quickly approaching the end of our time together. Quick reminders for viewers out there, do check out those links that I talked about at the very beginning of our time. Sue has one of the projects. So if you click the link that's on the banner on this page that you're watching, those Aliso, the mini projects that we had, there are 5 of them there, and one of them is Sue's, and it was a blast to watch make, and it seems to be incredibly useful in daily life. So go ahead and grab those downloads for those patterns just by clicking on the banner. And then also, we are asking for your feedback. We would love to have it so that we can continue to make these lives something that you want to continue to come back to, tell your friends about, and make them as amazing as we possibly can for you. So go ahead and click on that survey as well. It should be underneath your video viewer. So that said, this is your time to get in any final questions, and we'll get through as many as possible before I see my clock tell us it's time to wrap up. So here we go. We're going to jump in. Patty's got our next one. Do you have any tips for sewing a hem on a knit t-shirt with a double needle? Should I use fusible knit stay tape? Patty says that she's a new sewer.
Okay, so I would probably say the first thing is I would press the hem up exactly where you want it. And if you're a brand new sewer, I would even baste that hem in place. That way it's basted. You can always take that thread out later. And then it depends on what kind of stitch you're trying to form. If you're trying to go for the cover lock stitch with 2 needles on the bottom and then a squiggly wiggly on the back side, then I would, as soon as you're done basting, definitely get your needles aligned so that they go right over where that hem is. So like if here are your needles and then your hem is right here, go right over the center of it. And then if you have the ability to slow your speed down, kind of slow your speed. And then the big tip not to do, like the do not, is don't pull your fabric while you're stitching. Let the machine guide it along. There's a lot of other tips that you could use. There's different presser feet. As far as the hem tape, the problem is that you're taking something that's not meant to be stayed together. It's a knit. It's meant to stretch. So I would maybe try not to do the hem tape if you could avoid it, only because it's going to keep it in place, whereas you want it to stretch. Instead, if you were here earlier, I talked about using tissue paper. Put the tissue paper underneath. It'll just kind of help guide the fabric along. And then when you're done, you can rip that off. And then you're not worried about the permanent tape.
Okay, we have a question from Deanna. I'm going to ask it. It might not be in your wheelhouse, Sue, but we'll see. When you quilt, do you start from the center of the quilt and work your way out? Do you happen to know the answer to that one?
I do. I was always told you start from the center out, because as you get to the sides, material might shift. I was also told you never want to quilt an area smaller than the size of your hand. So like if you're quilting a big box, you still want something inside the center because it helps keep all the layers together. And yeah, but if you're doing, like, let's just say you're doing back and forth, you would most likely maybe not start in the center of the quilt, but you would start going down the center and then work your way out one side and work your way out another side. I'm not the quilting expert, so if others have better tips on that, but that's how I've always been taught.
Okay, I'm going to give you Heather's comment and have you kind of speak to this if you have anything to add, Sue. So Heather says, I don't know if this has been mentioned, but a narrow zigzag is great for edge seams on curtains. Straight stitches can sometimes pucker or make the edge roll, and the zigzag seam will look like a straight stitch when the current is hung up. Do you have any experience hemming curtains, anything like that that you could add, Sue?
I don't. I think it's a great idea. I mean, anything's worth trying. If you're doing a hem with if it's a sheer, I guess it really depends on the material. If it's a sheer material, um, then that makes good sense. I mean, sure, definitely try it out.
All right. Well, I have reached the end of our time together. So,
Mm.
Sue, before we say farewell, I always love to give just a little moment for you to say any final thoughts, anything that you're excited about working on soon, and then also where can people find you outside of this live event that we're wrapping up right now? So, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Leah. And thank you everybody for popping in here and being live. That really means a lot to all of us here. And I think it means a lot to the fellow viewers. You know, it's nice to have good questions and it kind of makes you think, oh, that's a good question. So one question leads to another good. For finding me, it's real easy. Sookie Sews, SOOKIESEWS. You can find me everywhere. I have a YouTube channel where we do all kinds of sewing, lots of Notion reviews. So if you're curious about like how that seam ripper worked, things like that. And then I also have an online sewing academy. Though right now it's been kind of heavy with machine embroidery, we've just released a couple of sewing projects as well. I'm excited about a lot of new things. If you're kind of curious about sergers, I've got a handful of new serger patterns that are coming out with video to go along with it. So yeah, Sookie Sews, you can find me everywhere.
All right. Well, with that said, it is time to say farewell for today's Craftsy Chats. But please, please, please come back and join us for another one as soon as you can. We love having you. I can't wait to speak again with you, Sue. And until we get together for the next one, I have to say, on behalf of Craftsy, Sue, and our entire team, my name is Leah. We will see you then. But until then, happy crafting.
Bye bye.